Welcome to Keith and I Don't Tread on Anyone and the Libertarian Institute. This is the Corbett Report subscriber, The Ukraine Crisis, What You Need to Know, Volume 12, Issue 5. I'm going to go over the highlights here. Corbett discusses the final straws prompting this military assault appear to have been an increase in NATO threats and provocations in recent months, including joint NATO-Ukrainian drills and an unprecedented $200 million airlift of weapons and ammunition to Kiev in January. The U.S.-NATO rejection of Russia's demands for a guarantee that NATO would not offer membership to Ukraine. Just as the Soviets putting missiles in Cuba almost started a nuclear war, not because Cuba's the 51st state of America, because that's too close for regimes that want a monopoly on violence. 3. An increase in fighting in the Donbass region between Ukrainian troops and Russia-backed separatists, leading to the latter asking Russia for military support. Corbett says, this, as we know, culminated with the Russian State Duma adopting a resolution calling on Putin to recognize Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics, DPR and LPR, which Putin did on February 21st. 3 days later, he announced a special military operation to protect the people of the Donbass. That special military operation very quickly expanded beyond the Donbass, striking targets in and near the Ukrainian capital of Kiev and elsewhere around the country. Corbett continues, for if you do listen only to the mockingbirds of the mainstream media, you believe that the history of Russian-Ukrainian relations began in 2014 when Russia invaded Crimea. You have heard from this fake news media that Russia simply decided to march into Ukraine in 2014, annex a chunk of Ukraine, and then taunt the international community for years by placing its military closer and closer to NATO bases. Indeed, if you took everything presented in this Team NATO narrative at face value, it would be impossible to see these unfolding events as anything but an act of unprovoked aggression by Putin and the Russians. But, as I noted in my recent Questions for Corbett episode on this crisis, your understanding of history depends entirely on where you start the clock on the history of recent events. If you started the clock on February 24th, 2022, then the matter is simple. The Russians suddenly declare war on Ukraine and began an unprovoked and unjustified invasion of that country. But why not start the clock on February 19th, 2022, when Ukrainian President Zelensky revealed his intentions to make Ukraine a nuclear power in violation of the Budapest Memorandum of 1994, when U.S. Vice President Kamala Harris accused Russia of spreading lies and disinformation before threatening unprecedented sanctions if Russia further invades Ukraine, and when German Chancellor Olaf Scholz berated Putin and the Russians for their aggressive actions and dismissed claims of genocide against the Russian-speaking people of the Donbass as ridiculous, to put it bluntly. Wouldn't those three statements provide a different perspective from which to view these events? Why stop there? Why not start the clock in January when the unprecedented airlift of hundreds of millions of dollars of weapons and ammunition began arriving in Ukraine? Or how about going back to last September during the joint Ukrainian-NATO military exercises? Or maybe we should begin the story in February of 2014 when the Ukrainian parliament passed the unconstitutional law to strip Viktor Yanukovych of his presidency. But then why not hark back to the sniper fire in Maidan Square later that month, which, it was later shown, was coordinated by the opposition in order to sow chaos and reap the whirlwind of regime change? Then again, we could cast our minds back to Victoria Nuland's infamous "fuck the EU" phone call in which she, as then U.S. Assistant Secretary of State, constructed the post-coup Ukrainian government, with U.S. Ambassador to Ukraine Jeffrey R. Pyatt, or we could look back to 2013 when Newland admitted that the U.S. had spent $5 billion on democracy promotion activities in Ukraine. But perhaps the clock is best started in 1990 when U.S. Secretary of State James Baker promised Mikhail Gorbachev that NATO would not expand 1 inch eastward after the reunification of Germany, and when German diplomat Jurgen Schorbog assured the Russians that we would not expand NATO beyond the Elbe. The Elbe River is on the northeastern part of Germany, going into the northern part of Czech Republic. Or should we begin the narrative in World War II when Bandera and his Ukrainian nationalist brethren collaborated with the National Socialists in a bid to maintain independence from Russia? Or maybe we should go back to the Holodomor, when Stalin intentionally starved over 3 million Ukrainians as part of an attempt to crush Ukrainian nationalist movements, or to 1918, when, according to Putin, the modern state of Ukraine was created by Lenin, who rejected the Donetsk Kievoy Rog Soviet Republic's request to be incorporated into Soviet Russia as a separate entity, and instead insisted that one government for all of Ukraine be created. Or maybe we could start the clock in the 11th century when the Kievan Rus Federation reached its greatest extent under Yaroslav the Wise. As you can see, everyone's view of history is colored by the context in which they see that history, and is shaped by how far back into history they want to go, and by what events they want to cherry pick from that history in order to make their case. Having said that, it is easy to see that the mainstream narrative that Russia is invading because Putin is Hitler is an aggressively stupid story that could be swallowed only by the most historically ignorant people on the planet, i.e. those who get their news from CNN. It is much more realistic to point out that Russia's actions have to be seen in light of the documented history of NATO aggression and intervention in Ukraine, and of NATO's undeniable attempt to support the Western-backed government in Kiev's campaign to slaughter the Russian speakers of the Donbass region. The next section of James Corbett's article asks, do you still believe that Putin is Russia, making the analogy that it's as ridiculous as saying Biden is NATO and Trump is America. He provides a number of issues showing Vladimir Putin shaking hands with Henry Kissinger, Klaus Schwab, along with President Xi being friends with all the same people. The vitally important document he cites is Joint Statement on the Russian Federation and the People's Republic of China on the international relations entering a new era and the global sustainable development. So, as cool as it is to be on Team Putin, to own the libs and own the people who control the press and Hollywood and our college professors and our teachers in high school, middle school, and elementary school, they still believe they own your body and have a better claim to your life than you do. Final point I want to make is from the Ron Paul Institute. This is an article that says, when the Bush administration announced in 2008 that Ukraine and Georgia would be eligible for NATO membership, I knew it was a terrible idea. This is Ron Paul speaking. Nearly 2 decades after the end of both the Warsaw Pact and the Cold War, expanding NATO made no sense. NATO itself made no sense. Explaining my no vote on a bill to endorse that expansion, I said at the time, NATO is an organization whose purpose ended with the end of the Warsaw Pact's adversary. This current round of NATO expansion is a political reward to governments in Georgia and Ukraine. that came to power as a result of U.S.-supported revolutions, the so-called Orange Revolution and Rose Revolution, providing U.S. military guarantees to Ukraine and Georgia can only further strain our military. This NATO expansion may well involve the U.S. military in conflicts unrelated to our national interest. That means an attack on Warsaw is the same thing as an attack on Wisconsin. An attack on one is an attack on all. An attack on Budapest is the same thing as an attack on Baton Rouge, Louisiana. This is what we're going to risk nuclear war over. A majority Russian geographical area could be risking a third world war, just like the Second World War was Danzig, Hitler invading Poland, September 1st, 1939. A majority German geographical area that was given to Poland after the Treaty of Versailles. Here's how close we have come to war with Russia, a nuclear power. This article is from the BBC News, November 14th, 2010. Singer James Blunt prevented World War III. Singer James Blunt has told the BBC how he refused an order to attack Russian troops when he was a British soldier in Kosovo. Blunt said he was willing to risk a court-martial by rejecting the order from a U.S. general. The U.S. general was Wesley Clark. Blunt, who was at the head of a column of 30,000 NATO troops with his unit, told Pinard's Politics it was a mad situation. Blunt left the army in 2002 to pursue a career in music, later scoring a worldwide hit with You're Beautiful. So yes, the elites are that crazy, but there are still some good people out there, and refusing to blindly obey orders is how we can get out of this thing. I'm going to end this with a quote from Gideon Rose from Foreign Affairs. I'm not able to show the whole clip because it is under copyright here. I'm going to have a link in the description to this full interview between Stephen Colbert and Foreign Affairs' Gideon Rose. Thank you for watching Keith Knight Don't Tread on Anyone and the Libertarian Institute.
The challenge here is to try to attract it to the West, to get it to flip sides.